There is a strange thing that happens when a place breaks a record for heat. For a day, maybe two, it makes the news. People share the number, marvel at it, joke about frying eggs on the sidewalk, and then move on. But what is happening in Phoenix, Arizona is not a single record, not a one-day headline, not a curiosity to be shared and forgotten. It is a cascade of records, one after another, falling so fast and so consistently that the very notion of what is normal for this city has come unmoored. Phoenix is breaking records that climate scientists a generation ago would have placed decades into the future. Records that were supposed to be the far edge of possibility, the worst case in the models. The line that would not be crossed until the second half of the century. And the city is crossing them now, this decade, again and again, in a way that has forced everyone who studies heat to confront an uncomfortable truth. The future arrived early, and it arrived in the desert. To understand why this is so alarming, you have to understand what a record actually is. A temperature record is not just a number. It is a statement about the boundaries of what a place has ever experienced in all the time human beings have been keeping track. When Phoenix sets a record for the hottest day, or the hottest month, or the most consecutive days above 110 degrees, or the warmest night ever recorded, it is saying that in more than a century of measurement. This has never happened before. And when those records fall not once in a lifetime, but several times in a single decade, when the old marks that stood for generations are shattered and then shattered again a year or two later, something fundamental has changed. The climate of Phoenix is not fluctuating around a stable average anymore. The average itself is moving, and it is moving upward, and the records are simply the leading edge of that movement, the places where the new reality announces itself most loudly. This is the story of that movement, of a city built to defeat the heat, now watching the heat rewrite the rules faster than anyone believed possible. Of records nobody thought this decade could produce falling like dominoes, and of what it means for the nearly 5 million people who call one of the hottest major cities on Earth their home. It is a story about numbers, but it is really a story about the thin and fragile line between a place being livable and a place being deadly, and about how quickly that line can move when the climate decides to shift beneath your feet. The city that was built to win you cannot make sense of what is happening in Phoenix without first understanding what Phoenix is. Because this is not a city that wandered into a hostile place by mistake. It was built here on purpose as a deliberate act of engineering ambition. A bet that human ingenuity could take one of the most punishing climates in North America and make it not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. For most of the last century, that bet looked like one of the great triumphs of modern civilization. The Sonoran Desert, where Phoenix sits, is a place of extraordinary and unforgiving heat. Long before the city existed, this was land that tested the limits of anyone who tried to live in it. But over the 20th century, a combination of technologies changed the equation entirely. Dams and canals reached across the desert to bring in water from distant rivers, turning dust into farmland and then into suburbs. The electrical grid spread its web across the valley. And above all, air conditioning arrived, the single invention that more than any other made the modern desert city possible. With air conditioning, the deadly afternoon became a background hum you could ignore from inside a cooled home, a cooled car, a cooled office. The heat outside no longer dictated the terms of life. It became something you passed through on your way from one cool box to another. And so the city grew explosively, decade after decade. People came from all over the country, drawn by the warmth, the space, the affordability, the promise of a life lived in perpetual sunshine. Phoenix became one of the fastest growing large cities in America. A sprawling metropolis of nearly 5 million people spread across the desert floor, its identity built entirely on the idea that the sun had been conquered. Retirees came to escape the cold. Families came for the growth and the opportunity. Businesses came for the low costs and the room to expand. The whole enterprise rested on an unspoken faith that the machinery would always hold, that the water would always flow, that the power would always run, and that the heat, however fierce, would always stay within the bounds that the machinery was built to handle. For a long time, that faith was rewarded. The city won its bet over and over and grew rich and large on the winning. The records now falling are the sound of that bet being called into question. Because the machinery was designed for a particular climate, a particular envelope of heat, and that envelope is now being exceeded. The city was built to win against the desert it knew. It is now facing a desert it has never met before. What a record really costs it is tempting to treat records as trivia, as entries in an almanac, as numbers that impress for a moment and then fade. But every heat record that Phoenix breaks carries a real and often hidden cost, and understanding those costs is the key to understanding why this decade's records are so much more than a statistical curiosity. Consider the record for consecutive days above 110 degrees. For most of the city's history, a stretch of such days was measured in a handful. A few brutal days in the depths of summer and then a break. In this decade, that record has been obliterated, with the city enduring streaks that ran on for weeks without a single day of relief, streaks so far beyond anything in the historical record that they redefined what an extreme heat event even looks like. And the cost of such a streak is not measured in the discomfort of the days. It is measured in the way the human body and the city itself is denied any chance to recover. A single 110-degree day is survivable for almost anyone. A month of them with no relief is a different thing entirely, a slow, accumulating assault that finds every vulnerable person in the city and presses on them without pause. The record is not just a number. It is a body count waiting to happen. Or consider the record for the warmest night. This is the record that gets the least attention and matters the most, and this decade has seen it fall repeatedly, with overnight lows that refuse to drop below 90 degrees, sometimes staying even higher night after night. In a healthy desert, the night is when the heat breaks. When the dry air lets the day's warmth radiate away into the sky and the temperature plunges, giving everything, bodies, buildings, the city itself, a chance to reset before the next day's assault. When the nights stop cooling, that reset never comes. The heat load in a person's body accumulates instead of clearing, and it is in those record warm nights. In the small hours after midnight during a weeks-long heat wave that people die quietly and out of sight, their bodies simply unable to shed enough heat to keep going. The record for the warmest night is, in a very real sense, the record most directly tied to death. Then there are the records that are almost too large to feel. The hottest month ever recorded, the hottest summer. The most days above 115 degrees in a single year. Each of these represents not a single extreme event, but a sustained departure from everything the city has known. A summer that was not just hot on its worst day, but hot on average. Hot in a grinding, relentless way that touched every hour of every day for months. These are the records that reveal the shift most clearly, because they cannot be dismissed as a fluke, a single bad day when the atmosphere lined up wrong. A record hot month is a statement about the entire season, and when those fall, they tell you that the baseline itself has moved. Why this decade and not the last? The question that haunts everyone watching these records fall is a simple one. Why now? Why is this decade producing heat that the last decade and the decades before it did not? The answer lies in the way climate change works, which is not the way most people intuitively imagine. People tend to picture global warming as a slow, gentle, uniform rise. A degree here, a degree there, spread evenly across the world and across the years. But that is not how it is felt on the ground. The warming of the global average is indeed gradual, but its effects arrive through the extremes, and they arrive unevenly, concentrating in certain places and certain kinds of events, when you nudge the entire distribution of temperatures upward. Even by a seemingly small amount, you do something dramatic to the tails of that distribution. You make the rare extremes far more common, and you push the ceiling of what is possible higher than it has ever been. A modest rise in the average translates into a large rise in the frequency and intensity of the hottest events. This is why a decade can feel so different from the one before it, even when the change in the average seems small. The average moved a little, but the extremes moved a lot. Phoenix is especially exposed to this dynamic for reasons both global and local. Globally, the accumulated warming of the planet has now reached a level where its fingerprint on extreme heat is unmistakable, loading the dice toward hotter summers, longer heat waves, and higher peaks. But layered on top of that global signal are powerful local amplifiers unique to a city like Phoenix. The most important of these is the urban heat island, the enormous mass of asphalt, concrete, and dark rooftops that the sprawling city has laid across the desert. Surfaces that soak up the sun's energy all day and radiate it back all night. As the city has grown, that heat island has grown with it, adding a local layer of warming on top of the global one and hitting the nights hardest of all. This is why Phoenix's record warm nights are so extreme. The city has built a machine for storing heat and releasing it after dark, and every new development, every new parking lot, every new mile of dark pavement makes that machine a little more powerful. The records this decade are the product of two forces converging, a warming planet and a self-heating city, and where they meet, the old marks fall. There is also the matter of drought, which acts as an amplifier of its own. The American West has been gripped by an extended drought, and dry conditions make heat worse in a direct physical way. When there is moisture in the soil and the landscape, some of the sun's energy goes into evaporating that moisture rather than heating the air, a natural air conditioning that moderates the temperature. But when the land is parched, as it has been, that moderating effect vanishes, and nearly all of the sun's energy goes straight into heat. A dry landscape runs hotter than a moist one under the same sun, and a region locked in drought is a region primed to break heat records. The dryness and the heat feed each other in a vicious loop. The heat dries the land, and the dry land amplifies the heat. And around it goes, driving the temperature higher than either force could manage alone. The physics of a body in record heat, to understand why these records matter so viscerally, you have to leave the realm of statistics and enter the realm of the human body. Because in the end, that is where a heat record is truly felt. The human body is a machine for maintaining a stable internal temperature, and it is a machine with hard limits, limits that record heat pushes directly against. Your body works constantly to hold its core temperature near 98.6 degrees, and it is exquisitely sensitive to any deviation. When the environment is cooler than your skin, you shed excess heat easily, radiating it away into the surrounding air. But when the air temperature climbs above your skin temperature, and at 115 degrees it is far above, that pathway reverses. The air is no longer taking heat away from you, it is adding heat to you. At that point, your body has only one significant tool left for cooling itself: sweat. As sweat evaporates off your skin, it carries heat away, and in the dry desert air, that evaporation happens quickly and efficiently. This is the one great advantage of a dry heat over a humid one, and it is the reason human beings can survive Phoenix summers at all. But sweating is not a limitless resource. It depends on having enough water in your body to keep producing sweat. And it depends on the air being dry enough to accept the moisture. Push either of those limits, and the cooling fails. When the cooling fails, the body's core temperature begins to rise, and the consequences escalate with terrifying speed. First comes heat exhaustion, the body straining to cope, producing dizziness, nausea, headache, weakness, a racing heart, a sense that something has gone badly wrong. This is the warning stage, the body's alarm, and if the person can get to a cooler place and rehydrate, they can usually recover. But if the heat continues, if the core temperature keeps climbing past a critical threshold, the body crosses into heat stroke, and heat stroke is a catastrophe. At that point, the internal temperature is high enough to begin damaging the organs and the brain directly. The body's ability to regulate itself collapses entirely. Confusion sets in, then unconsciousness, and without immediate emergency cooling and care, death can follow within hours. Heat stroke is not an exotic danger. It is the ordinary way that extreme heat kills, and every record that pushes the temperature higher and the heat waves longer pushes more people toward that threshold. And crucially, the danger is not distributed equally across the population. Record heat is a filter, and it finds the vulnerable first. The elderly, whose bodies regulate temperature less effectively and who are more likely to live alone and to have chronic conditions, are at the greatest risk, and they die in disproportionate numbers in every major heat event. People with heart disease, diabetes, respiratory conditions, and other illnesses that heat aggravates are highly exposed. Certain common medications interfere with the body's ability to cool itself, quietly raising the risk for people who may not even know it. Infants and young children whose bodies are less able to cope are vulnerable. And above all, the people at greatest risk are those who cannot escape the heat, who lack reliable air conditioning, who work outdoors, who are homeless, who cannot afford to run their cooling as much as they need to. A record heat wave does not kill randomly. It searches out every weak point in the human defenses against heat, and it presses on them until they break. The grid that everything depends on. If air conditioning is what makes Phoenix possible, then the electrical grid is the thread from which the entire city hangs. And record heat pulls that thread tighter than it has ever been pulled. This is perhaps the single greatest vulnerability that the record-breaking heat exposes, and it is the one that keeps emergency planners awake at night. The logic is stark. In Phoenix, air conditioning is not a comfort, but a necessity, a form of life support for nearly 5 million people. During a record heat wave, essentially every air conditioner in the city runs at or near full capacity around the clock for days or weeks on end. The demand for electricity soars to staggering levels, and it stays there. And here is the cruel part. Extreme heat does not just increase the demand for power, it simultaneously degrades the ability to supply it. Power lines carry electricity less efficiently when they are hot. Transformers and other equipment strain and are more likely to fail under sustained high temperatures. Some forms of power generation lose efficiency in extreme heat. So at the precise moment when the city's demand for electricity reaches its absolute peak, the grid's ability to deliver that electricity is at its most compromised. The system is being asked to do the most exactly when it is least able. This sets up the nightmare scenario, the one that turns a heat record from a public health challenge into a potential mass casualty catastrophe, a major prolonged power failure during a record heat wave. If the grid were to fail on a large scale during a stretch of record heat. A cascading blackout spreading across the network during a week of 115-degree days, the consequences would be almost unthinkable. Hundreds of thousands of air-conditioned homes would become ovens within hours. The people inside them, especially the vulnerable, would have nowhere to go and no way to cool down, in a city where the outdoor temperature offers no refuge day or night. Researchers who have modeled exactly this scenario for Phoenix have produced genuinely alarming projections of the death and suffering that a blackout during an extreme heat wave could cause. It stands as one of the starkest illustrations of how completely the city's survival depends on a single fragile system, and of how the records now being broken are steadily narrowing the margin of safety on which everyone in the city unknowingly relies. This is the deeper meaning of the phrase "the city was built to win." The victory over the desert is real, but it is entirely conditional. It holds only as long as the power holds. Every record that pushes the heat higher and the demand greater brings the system closer to its limits, and the day the system fails during a record heat wave is the day the victory is revealed to have been borrowed all along. The water beneath the heat. Behind every question about heat in Phoenix lies a question about water. And the record-breaking temperatures make the water problem sharper and more urgent than ever. This is a desert city of millions, and it does not draw its water from the sky. It draws it from rivers reaching across the desert, above all from the Colorado River, carried hundreds of miles through a vast system of canals, and from the Salt and Verde rivers nearer to home, along with groundwater pumped from beneath the valley floor. Every one of those sources is under strain, and record heat strains them further. The Colorado River, the great artery of the American Southwest, has been shrinking for years under the combined pressure of drought and overuse, its enormous reservoirs falling toward levels that threaten the deliveries the entire region depends upon. Arizona sits in a particularly exposed position in the complex system of water rights that governs the river, among the first in line to face cuts when the water runs short. This is the backdrop against which the heat records fall, and the heat makes it worse in direct and indirect ways. Extreme heat drives up the demand for water, for drinking, for the cooling systems that keep the city alive, for the trees and landscaping that provide precious shade, for agriculture for every purpose. At the same time, record heat accelerates evaporation, pulling water out of the reservoirs and the soil and the plants faster, so that even as demand rises, supply is quietly bled away by the sun. And water and power are not separate problems. They are two halves of a single system, deeply intertwined. Moving and treating water takes enormous amounts of electricity, and much of the region's electricity generation depends in turn on water. Strain one and you strain the other. A record heat wave leans on both at once, driving up the demand for water and power simultaneously while degrading the ability to supply either. In a place like Phoenix, water and power together form a single life support machine for the population, and the records now being broken are pressing on every part of that machine at the same time. The heat is not just a matter of temperature. It is a matter of whether the deepest foundations of the city, its water and its energy, can bear the load that a hotter climate places upon them. The uneven map of suffering, one of the most important truths about record heat, is that it does not fall evenly across a city. Two people living just a few miles apart in Phoenix can experience a record heat wave in profoundly different ways, and the difference between them often tracks precisely the difference between comfort and danger, between safety and death. Record heat exposes with brutal clarity the inequalities that were always present but usually stay hidden. Part of this is the geography of the heat island itself. The urban heat island is not uniform. It burns hottest in the densest, most paved over, least green parts of the city, and those areas are very often the older, lower income neighborhoods, the places with the least tree cover. The fewest parks, the most asphalt, and the least shade, the oldest and least efficient housing. A wealthy neighborhood with mature trees, ample shade, and modern, well-insulated homes can run measurably cooler than a poor neighborhood of bare streets and aging apartments just a short distance away, when a record heat wave arrives. The people in the hotter neighborhoods face a more extreme version of it, and they typically have fewer resources to protect themselves from it. The map of where the heat is worst overlaps disturbingly with the map of who has the least ability to escape it. Then there is the matter of who must be outside. A record heat wave is one thing for someone who can move between a cooled home, a cooled car, and a cooled workplace, passing through the heat only in brief, controlled doses. It is something else entirely for the people whose lives are lived in the open. There are the outdoor workers, the construction crews, the landscapers, the roofers laboring directly on sun-baked surfaces, the delivery drivers, the agricultural workers, the warehouse workers in buildings that were never built to be cooled, for whom record heat is an occupational hazard that intensifies with every degree and every day. There are the people experiencing homelessness, thousands of them living on streets where the pavement itself can grow hot enough to cause severe contact burns, with no cooled refuge to retreat to and few defenses against a heat that never relents. In recent years, as the records have fallen, the death toll among the unsheltered during Phoenix heat waves has climbed to genuinely alarming levels, a grim measure of what record heat does to those with the least protection from it. And there are the people who have air conditioning but cannot afford to use it as much as they need to, who watch their electricity bills climb through a record-long heat wave and ration their own cooling to save money, gambling their health against their budget in a calculation no one should have to make. There are the elderly living alone, sometimes with a broken air conditioner they cannot afford to fix, sometimes simply not recognizing how much danger they are in until it is too late. These are the people who appear again and again in the grim tallies that follow every major heat event. The city offers a cooled world, but access to that world is not guaranteed, and record heat drives a wedge into every crack in that access. So that the same heat wave that is a mere inconvenience for some is a mortal threat for others. This is why so many who study extreme heat describe it not simply as a weather problem, but as a matter of justice, one that maps closely onto existing lines of wealth and poverty. A record heat wave does not arrive in an equal city. It arrives in a divided one, and it presses hardest exactly where the ability to push back is weakest. The silent nature of the killer there is a reason that extreme heat, for all its lethality, has historically commanded so much less attention and urgency than other kinds of disaster. And understanding that reason is essential to understanding why the records falling in Phoenix are so dangerous. Heat is the silent killer. It does not look like a catastrophe, and so, for a long time, it was not treated like one. Think of how other disasters announce themselves. A hurricane roars ashore, tearing roofs from houses and hurling boats onto streets. A wildfire throws up a towering wall of flame visible from space. A flood swallows entire neighborhoods, leaving a visible line of destruction. A tornado carves a path of splintered wreckage across the land. These disasters are loud, visible, dramatic, and they command an immediate and overwhelming response precisely because their damage is so plain to see. Heat does none of this. A record heat wave leaves the buildings standing, the streets intact, the trees upright. It kills quietly, mostly indoors, mostly out of sight, its victims dying alone in overheated homes and on hidden streets. There is no dramatic footage of a heat wave, no obvious wreckage, no clear before and after. And so, for generations, the public response and the political urgency lagged far behind the actual toll, even though heat is by a wide margin. one of the deadliest forms of extreme weather there is. This invisibility is compounded by the way heat kills. Heat rarely appears as the single simple cause of death. Instead, it pushes vulnerable bodies past the edge, aggravating heart conditions, straining organs already weakened by illness, tipping people with underlying vulnerabilities over into crisis. In the official accounting, a death during a heat wave may be attributed to a heart attack or an organ failure, with the heat's role as the trigger obscured. This means the true toll of extreme heat has often been undercounted, its dangers systematically underestimated, its victims statistically invisible. The records falling in Phoenix are so significant in part because they are forcing this invisible killer into the light, making its toll impossible to ignore, and demanding that heat finally be treated with the seriousness that its lethality has always warranted. A record-breaking heat wave sustained over weeks produces a wave of death that even the imperfect accounting cannot hide. And in that terrible visibility lies a kind of grim clarity about what this decade's heat is really doing. A city waking up to the danger faced with records nobody thought possible, Phoenix has been forced to respond, and in doing so it has become, out of sheer necessity, one of the world's leading laboratories for how a modern city confronts extreme heat. The response is imperfect and incomplete, a matter of managing a crisis rather than solving it, but it represents a genuine and important reckoning with a danger that can no longer be ignored. The city has taken steps that once would have seemed extraordinary. It established a dedicated government office focused specifically on heat, one of the first cities in the world to do so. Charged with coordinating the response to exactly this kind of emergency, treating heat as the serious and ongoing threat it has become rather than as a background fact of desert life. During heat waves, the city opens and operates networks of cooling centers, public spaces where people without adequate air conditioning can go to escape the worst of the day. Spaces that in a record heat wave can be the difference between life and death for the most vulnerable. There are programs to check on the elderly and the isolated, to distribute water, to reach the homeless population and get people into cooled shelter, to spread awareness of the dangers and the resources available. These efforts save lives, real and measurable numbers of them. And they represent a city learning in real time how to keep its people alive through heat that its founders never imagined. But the leaders and experts driving this response are the first to acknowledge its limits. These measures are fundamentally reactive, a way of managing the danger as it arrives rather than removing the danger itself. A cooling center saves the person who reaches it, but it does nothing to lower the temperature or shorten the heat wave. An outreach program protects the vulnerable it manages to find, but the heat keeps coming. As long as the records keep falling, as long as each heat wave arrives longer and hotter than the last, the reactive measures must strain harder and harder to keep pace. And the question of whether management alone can be enough grows more pressing with every summer. The city is running faster and faster simply to stay in place, and the heat is not slowing down. Redesigning a city for a hotter world, the deeper recognition now taking hold in Phoenix is that reactive measures, however vital, are not enough on their own. That if the city is to remain livable in the climate now arriving, it must be physically remade, redesigned to work with the desert rather than merely to conquer it with machinery. This is a monumental undertaking, the work of decades, but it is the only path that addresses the problem at its root rather than merely treating its symptoms. At the heart of this effort is a war on the urban heat island, the self-inflicted local warming that the city built into its own concrete and asphalt. One of the most powerful weapons in that war is remarkably simple: shade. A shaded street can be dramatically cooler than a bare one exposed to the full force of the sun. And shade is one of the oldest and most effective defenses against desert heat that exists. And so the city has launched aggressive efforts to plant trees and expand its canopy, to create shade over sidewalks and streets and public spaces, to bring the temperature down at the human scale where people actually live and walk. There are programs to install cool pavements, reflective coatings and materials that bounce the sun's energy away instead of absorbing it, chipping away at the heat-storing capacity of the vast paved surfaces the city has laid down. There is a growing push to rethink how and where new development happens, to build in ways that trap less heat and demand less energy. to break the pattern of endless dark sprawl that made the heat island so powerful in the first place. Alongside the effort to cool the city physically runs an effort to harden its critical systems, above all the electrical grid on which everything depends. There is enormous investment in making the grid more resilient and reliable, in adding capacity to meet the soaring demand of record heat waves, in building in redundancy so that a single failure cannot cascade into the catastrophic blackout that everyone fears. There is investment in expanding and diversifying the sources of power and in the water infrastructure that is the grid's inseparable partner. None of this is quick, and none of it is cheap, and none of it alone is sufficient. But together, these efforts represent a fundamental shift in the city's understanding of itself. A recognition that the old bet, the faith that the machinery would always simply hold against whatever the desert could throw at it, is no longer safe to make. The city that was built to win by brute force is learning that it must instead become something subtler and more adaptive, a city that works with its climate rather than merely overpowering it if it wants to keep its promise to the millions who live in it. The psychology of endless heat there is a dimension to record breaking heat that the thermometers cannot capture. And it may matter as much as the physical toll what a summer of relentless record shattering heat does to the mind of a city. When heat lasts a day or two, people treat it as an event to be waited out, an inconvenience with a clear end. Something in the human mind is built to endure a bad afternoon knowing relief is coming. But when the records fall and keep falling, when the heat does not break for weeks, when every morning brings another day of triple digits and every night refuses to cool, something shifts. The heat stops being an event and becomes a condition, a permanent weight pressing on every decision and every hour. Life itself contracts under that weight. People stop going outside. Parks and playgrounds empty. The ordinary rhythms that make a place feel alive, the morning walk, children playing in the yard, the evening spent on a porch, the casual encounters of a neighborhood in motion, simply stop. Because to step into the open in the middle of a record heat wave is to step into something that can genuinely hurt you. A city of nearly 5 million people retreats indoors and waits, and the longer the wait, the more the strain shows, not only on bodies, but on tempers, on mental health, on the invisible social fabric that holds a community together. Isolation deepens, especially for the vulnerable and the elderly, who may go days without stepping outside or seeing another person. The relentless heat wears on people in ways that are hard to measure but impossible to miss for anyone living through it, a low and constant pressure that colors everything. For the people on the front lines of the response, the paramedics, the emergency room staff, the outreach workers walking the encampments in the worst of the afternoon, the utility crews keeping the grid alive. A record heat wave is a marathon with no visible finish line. Each day brings more heat-related emergencies, more people found in distress, more of the exhausting work of trying to reach the vulnerable before the heat does. This is not a single dramatic rescue with a beginning and an end. It is weeks of sustained crisis, and it asks the people fighting it to keep going long after they are spent. The strain compounds because systems built to handle occasional bad days are not built to handle a month of them stacked end to end. Ambulance calls climb. Emergency rooms fill with heat cases. The machinery of care, like the machinery of power and water, is run at a level and for a duration it was never designed to sustain. A record heat wave, in other words, does not just test the infrastructure of steel and concrete and wire. It tests the human infrastructure too. The people and the institutions and the shared resilience of a community asked to endure something without precedent. When the records become the new normal, perhaps the most insidious aspect of a decade of falling records is the way the extraordinary quietly becomes ordinary. The way each new extreme, once survived, resets the baseline of what people expect and accept. This is one of the great dangers of a shifting climate, not just that the extremes grow worse, but that they grow familiar. So that a level of heat that would have been almost unimaginable a generation ago comes to be treated as simply the way summer is now. A generation ago, a handful of days above 110 degrees in a Phoenix summer was the price of desert living, absorbed without much thought. The idea of a month of such days in a row, of nights that never dropped below 90. Of summers ranking as the hottest ever recorded one after another would have sounded like exaggeration. Now these things are the material of headlines, and the deeper fear is not that they happened once, but that they are becoming the shape of things to come. That a record-shattering summer is not the ceiling but a new floor, a preview of summers that will test the city harder still. When the baseline moves, the extremes move with it, and events that were once unthinkable slide into the range of the merely unusual, and then into the range of the expected. Each record, once broken, subtly redefines what counts as normal, and the new normal becomes the launching point for the next record. This is the quiet violence of a warming climate. It does not simply add a few degrees and stop. It reshuffles the entire deck of what a city has to be ready for, and it does so faster than concrete and power lines and institutions and human habits can easily adapt. There is a real danger in this normalization, because a threat that comes to feel ordinary is a threat that loses its power to mobilize. If each record-breaking summer is met with a shrug, treated as just another hot year in a hot place, then the urgency required to actually adapt, to remake the city, to harden the grid, to protect the vulnerable at the scale the danger demands, never fully materializes. The records keep falling, but the response stays calibrated to a danger that people have stopped truly seeing. Precisely because they have seen so much of it. The challenge for Phoenix and for every place following in its path is to keep feeling the alarm that the numbers warrant even as the numbers become routine. To refuse to let the extraordinary become invisible simply because it has become frequent. What the records are really telling us: step back from any single record, from any single number, and consider what the whole cascade of them, falling one after another through this decade, is actually telling us. Because the true significance of what is happening in Phoenix is not contained in any one figure. It is contained in the trend, in the relentless accelerating pattern of old marks being shattered and new ones being set, only to be shattered again. For most of human history, the climate of a place could be treated as a stable backdrop, a fixed set of conditions around which life was organized. There were good years and bad years, hot summers and mild ones, but they fluctuated around an average that itself held more or less steady across generations. The infrastructure of a city, its buildings and its power grid and its water systems, its very design was built on the assumption of that stability, calibrated to the climate that had always been. What the records falling in Phoenix reveal is that this assumption has broken. The climate is no longer a stable backdrop. The average itself is moving and moving quickly, and the records are simply the leading edge of that movement. The places where the new reality first breaks through. When records fall not once in a lifetime, but repeatedly in a single decade, it is proof that the ground has shifted beneath the city, that the climate it was built for is receding into the past faster than anyone anticipated. And the trend line does not point toward relief. Everything that has driven this decade's records, the accumulated warming of the planet, the ever-growing urban heat island, the grip of drought on the region, is projected to continue or intensify. The city is still growing, still adding people and pavement, still spreading across the desert. The forces that broke the records are still in motion, which means the records that stand today are very unlikely to stand for long. The heat waves are projected to grow longer, the nights hotter, the peaks higher, the demands on the grid and the rivers greater. The records nobody thought possible this decade are, in all likelihood, a preview of records that will seem modest by the standards of the decades to come. That is the sobering message written in the numbers. Not that Phoenix has passed through an unusually hot patch that will fade, but that it has crossed into a new climate, one that will keep breaking its own records for the foreseeable future. The numbers behind the numbers. It is worth pausing on the mechanics of how these records are actually measured and verified, because the rigor behind them is part of what makes them so hard to dismiss. Temperature records are not casual observations. They come from official weather stations maintained to exacting standards, with instruments calibrated and cited according to strict protocols, recording the conditions continuously and archiving them in databases that stretch back well over a century. When a record falls, it is not a matter of someone's thermometer reading high on a hot porch. It is a measurement taken by the same kind of instrument, in the same kind of setting, by the same methods that produced every record before it, which is precisely what makes the comparison meaningful. The old mark and the new mark are measured the same way, so when the new one exceeds the old, It is a genuine apples-to-apples statement that this has never happened before in the entire record. This continuity of measurement is what gives the records their power as evidence. A single hot day could be dismissed as a fluke of local conditions, a quirk of one station on one afternoon. But a decade of records across many different measures. The hottest day, the hottest night. The hottest month, the longest streak, the most days above a given threshold, all pointing in the same direction, all breaking marks that stood for generations, cannot be waved away. The sheer consistency of the trend, measured rigorously across many independent metrics, is the signal that rises above any single day's noise. And that signal says unambiguously that the climate of Phoenix has moved into territory it has never occupied in all the time the city has been keeping track. The records are not anecdotes, they are data collected with care over more than a century, and the story they tell is the most credible kind of story there is, the kind written not by opinion but by measurement. There is also a sobering mathematical reality embedded in the way records fall, one that turns the raw frequency of record breaking into evidence all its own. In a stable climate, records become harder and harder to break over time because as the decades accumulate, the existing records represent ever more extreme events that are ever less likely to be exceeded by chance. The longer the record of measurement grows, the more exceptional a new event must be to top everything that came before it. And so, in a climate that was truly holding steady, the pace of record setting should slowly and inexorably decline as the years pile up and the bar keeps rising. You would expect record breaking to slow down, not speed up, as the historical record lengthens. The fact that Phoenix is breaking records faster, not slower, that old marks are falling more frequently as the decade wears on, is itself a powerful indicator that the climate is not stable. It is exactly the pattern you would expect from a shifting baseline, and it is exactly the opposite of what a stable climate would produce. The acceleration of record breaking is, in a sense, the fingerprint of change, visible in the raw statistics for anyone who cares to look. When records that should be getting harder to break are instead falling in clusters, the mathematics itself is telling you that the underlying rules have changed. Why Phoenix is everyone's story? It would be easy to file all of this under the particular troubles of one unusually hot city in one unusually hostile desert, a local story with little bearing on the wider world. That would be a serious mistake. What is happening in Phoenix matters far beyond Phoenix, because the city is a preview, the clearest, most advanced example of a future that a growing share of the world is heading toward. Phoenix is in effect a live experiment in one of the central questions of the coming century. Can a large modern city adapt quickly enough to a climate growing more hostile than the one it was built for? The city is being forced to answer that question in real time, at scale. Under the pressure of records that keep falling faster than the adaptations can keep pace, and the lessons it learns about shade and cool pavements and grid resilience, about cooling centers and heat offices, and the protection of the vulnerable, about the deep entanglement of water and power and heat, about the way extreme heat exposes and deepens inequality, are lessons that cities all over the world will need, because extreme heat is not a uniquely Phoenician problem. It is a rapidly spreading global one. Heat waves are intensifying and lengthening across the planet. Cities that once considered themselves temperate are now confronting heat they were never designed to handle, often with even less preparation than Phoenix has, because they never imagined they would need it. The urban heat island effect afflicts every large city, everywhere. The vulnerabilities that record heat exposes in Phoenix, the fragile dependence on the power grid, the uneven map of who suffers, the silent and undercounted nature of heat death are vulnerabilities shared by cities the world over. So Phoenix is not a distant curiosity. It is a warning and a lesson delivered early and delivered clearly about the world that a warming climate is bringing. It is a city standing at the leading edge of a global transformation, discovering, record by record, just how thin the line between livable and unlivable can be, and just how fast that line can move when the climate shifts. The rest of the world would do well to watch closely, because the heat that is breaking records nobody thought possible in the desert this decade is the same heat, in milder form for now, that is coming for everywhere else. What Phoenix learns about surviving it and what it fails to learn will shape not just the future of one desert metropolis, but the future of urban life on a hotter planet. The line that keeps moving in the end, the story of Phoenix's record-breaking heat, comes down to a single unsettling realization. The line between a place being livable and a place being deadly is not fixed, and it is not far away. For most of the city's history, that line sat comfortably beyond the reach of anything the desert could produce, held there by the triumphant machinery of water and power and air conditioning. The heat was fierce, but it stayed within the envelope the machinery was built to handle, and the city won its bet year after year. What this decade's records reveal is that the envelope has been breached, that the heat is now reaching levels the machinery was never designed for, and that the line between livable and unlivable, once so reassuringly distant, has crept much closer than anyone believed possible. Every record that falls is the line moving. Every streak of days above 110 that shatters the old mark, every night that refuses to cool below 90, every month that ranks as the hottest ever recorded is a small step in the same direction, toward a threshold that no one wants to imagine crossing. The city is not there yet. The machinery still holds, the power still runs, the water still flows, the cooled world is still available to most who need it, and the vast apparatus of adaptation and emergency response still manages, most of the time, to keep the death toll from becoming something truly catastrophic. But the margin is narrowing, summer by summer, record by record, and the question that hangs over the whole valley is no longer whether the climate is changing, but whether the city can change fast enough to keep up with it. That is the real meaning of the records nobody thought possible this decade. They are not trivia. They are not a passing hot spell. They are the sound of a climate shifting beneath one of the great cities of the American desert, a warning written in temperatures that keep climbing past every mark that came before. Phoenix was built to win against the desert, and for a century, it did. Now it is discovering that the desert it beat is gone, replaced by a hotter and more dangerous one that keeps rewriting the rules faster than the city can learn them. The records will keep falling, the line will keep moving, and the whole world, whether it knows it yet or not, has a stake in whether the city built for the sun can survive a sun grown fiercer than it was ever meant to face. For now, the people of Phoenix wake each summer morning and check the forecast the way people in other places check for storms, watching to see how high the number will climb and how long the streak will run. They have learned to live in the shadow of records that were never supposed to be possible, to arrange their lives around a heat that keeps setting new marks, to trust in a machinery of water and power and cooled air that has held so far but grows more strained with every record that falls. They are, in a sense, all of us, a little further down a road that the whole world